So if we start with the object part, vital normativity as an object, the question, of course, is the question of vital norms. What are they? What is their nature? How can we classify them? Are they sane? Is there a plurality of norms? The question of exploring them in concrete settings, metaphysical commitment. So many of the things that Alejandro did, in fact, raised both in his presentation and in his talk. And then the question of the relationship between vital norms and other norms. So the question that, for example, Ella, Timotei, and Konrad raised. So how are vital norms related to rational norms? How are they related to social norms, communal norms? And also the question of implicit versus explicit norms. And then finally, on this objective side, is vital normativity in relation to other phenomena in organismal biology and also within the philosophical arena more broadly construed. For instance, Javier, Aranza, Alejandro all said that it would be really nice to have more concrete specific topics or subjects where we would talk about this particular question, not just on a certain meta level. Then the second thing that Timotei brought up, and it's also related to the very question of the relations between vital norms and other norms. For example, how does the vital relate to the human, so to speak? For example, the question of consciousness, high-level rationality, and so on and so forth. Then the question of teleology and causality more generally. So Vera mentioned this in her talk, for example. Yogi was talking about this. And then a very interesting question brought forth by Aranza, also joined by Javier and Vera, the relationship between the organism and the tissue, and then more broadly construed the relationship between the whole and the part, and then from this, the question of whole and the part, the nature of the wholeness. So how does one construe the wholeness, as Jan asked, so the question of totality or wholeness, and especially how, if you are really talking about the wholeness, what does it mean to have a perspective on it and approach it from a certain slant? And this already then brings us to the second subsection, which is the question about methodology and epistemology, let's say. And here, probably one of, or maybe this is my own bias, is the one that I mentioned, and also Andreas found very interesting, and Primoz from a slightly different perspective. So this relationship between knowing life and you yourself, being a living knower. So the fact that, in a certain sense, to use the Jonassian phrase, life knows life. So that there's a life as an object and life as a subject, very, very loosely and broadly construed. And then a very important question, which was raised by many, many people, Aranza, Konrad, me, Predrag, the relationship between philosophy of life and science of life. So if you want to understand it, how are you going to approach it? So philosophical approach, scientific approach, what does this mean? How does it unfold? Is collaboration possible? No. How should it be done? How is the openness to be cultivated, that Konrad said? Then Yogi was speaking about crisis of biology. We basically just have to, basically remain open and wait. They're going to come and beg. What are your good? Do you have any good conceptions? Any good things? We're gonna be lost. And then Predrag was suggesting the baby step approach, like small, incremental, local approaches. And then a very interesting thing that was also raised and mentioned is the plurality of methodologies when approaching life. Timotei, Vera, many others also mentioned this. For example, one being, this was mentioned on several occasions. Yogi would say, "Oh, I find it so interesting, you people who know all this historical stuff. And I can see, I find it amazing that 8 years ago somebody is developing something that I'm now kind of rediscovering in my work. So how does one productively relate this historicity or historical approach with the more contemporary approaches and contemporary discourses?" Then a very interesting question was raised about formalization. What role does formalization play here? what are its benefits, what are its limits, how to do it well, as Moritz suggested that we should maybe try. And this is a very interesting question, I think. It's also very easy to fall into some oversimplified dichotomies where you either are a complete fan or complete hater with regards to this. And I found myself in different time periods where I would oscillate from one to the other. And hopefully I'm now kind of reaching a more balanced state. And then Primož also mentioned the importance of the phenomenological investigation of life phenomena. And not necessarily presupposing that every account, so to speak, has to be done in the sense of having certain strong ontological commitments. And then maybe the last one, which is, of course, severely and chronically underdeveloped here. I wanted to maybe add a bit more, and it wasn't fully articulated or spelled out, but it was constantly present. Basically, the question of different modes of knowing. I don't know how else to put it, but I think that the phenomenon of life is a very interesting phenomenon in this regard, because in many ways it is a very profound challenge to a currently predominant, let's say, epistemic approach, the one that is seen as being the deliverer of proper knowledge. And the phenomenon of life can be challenging to this approach. And of course then everybody might say, okay, this is because you have a very overtly narrow conception of, say, naturalism, or overtly narrow conception of mechanicism. And I don't want to go into this, but the question is, does it open interesting room for reflection? Charles, for example, was talking about this, and he said himself that this is not an exhaustive dichotomy, but naturalism versus transcendentalism. And then you have, for example, again, another exaggerated dichotomy, mechanical account versus something that would be a pure shell. I'm not sure whether Andreas would be willing to kind of go into this category, but some of the things that he was saying would be very much in the sense of, all this is nice and well what we're doing there with the mechanical and formal stuff, but there's this other mode of knowing that is completely neglected, and so on and so forth. And exploring also this field, I think, is a very interesting thing that could be done. And then ultimately, what does this mean for the different knowing practices? How do you cultivate these types of knowledges? Because one thing that and on this note I'm ending, and then basically I would really be happy if you would be the one leading and I would maybe just be doing some coordinating. There's this strange presupposition that somehow the mode of knowledge that was developed with modern science somehow does not have its own habitus. It does not have its own, let's say, existential attitude. But this is clearly not true. Scientific, for example, a scientist has a certain habitus. He's approaching his, he or she is approaching, or they are approaching the phenomena from a certain perspective and in a certain way, and there's a whole context within which this is done, right? So it's not like it's happening nowhere, and all the institutional frameworks are, in a certain sense, a manifestation of what is deemed to be the prototypical way of doing this. So this what is sometimes called, the idea of philosophy or any type of knowing as a mode or a way of life, this is also an interesting question, because it raises the questions of actually, for example, the practices of producing these types of gnoseological or epistemological inquiries, and how they reflect, how they relate, how they feed into your way of being, like the preferred modes of being, and how this is related. And again, then basically we get back to the question of knowing life versus living knowledge. So, okay, this is a thematic field. Now, it is up to you what you would like to explore or touch upon, and we can also go into other directions. Maybe if you want to be more practical, what do we do with what we've said here? But like I said, I would like to now put myself into the background and turn you into the figures. Yeah.
This is like a topic that wasn't actually mentioned, but it's funny because it wasn't mentioned a lot actually at this conference. but the sort of like mental illness, mental pathology approach, and what vital normativity might give to like conceptualizations of mental health problems, for instance. Because I don't know, I was talking with a friend recently, so like that what he notices in like he works with patients a lot, and he also knows a bit of like activism, but like a sort of, he describes it as a rigidity of, you know, this sort of regulating structures.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's very common, that mental health patients have like, it's not that like something is like missing, but the whole framework of, maybe we could call it like some sort of normativity is sort of too rigid, or maybe kind of, you know, too loose, like in this sense. So I mean, I'm just mentioning this because I saw that, you know, Goldstein and Liam and all of them are actually talking about normativity primarily also from the standpoint of pathology, and it might be an interesting topic also to delve into that.
It is.
But it does get very complicated when you come to like human mental illnesses to talk about norms on that level. I think it takes a lot of these, like Conrad is all about also trying to build these bridges. How do we go from a norm on this seemingly, obviously not simple level of the organism to a norm that tries to describe what is normal psychological behavior in human? I think that that's a very difficult situation that requires us to address a lot of other questions of sociality, of culture, and ecology, and just a philosophy of life is far from sufficient, I think, to be able to really address that.
I agree there, but I also think just from a purely like more of a pragmatic way, not maybe conceptualizing what these norms are, but this sort of regulative activity, like, or like just this processual structure of like how we regulate ourselves might be interesting also in relation to maybe some sort of more complex higher order things.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry, I should step in, but yeah, but the mental health issue is a very interesting topic, and I don't consider myself an expert at all. There's so many people working on it from organist and an active perspective, and it is very complex. It involves many layers, but we should have a say on that. And there is a very interesting debate with anti-psychiatric movement that usually tends to move away from the notion of normativity because it's being used in an oppressive manner against people that have suffered more from the social normative, even or just labeling of their condition as an illness or an anomaly or whatever, than from the very situation they are experiencing. But I think organicism and activism in particular has resources to help. First of all, because norms are individual and specific to a life process. So there's nothing on the species that should, it's much more problematic when you go to reductionistic accounts of norms that coming from evolution. Homosexuality is obviously an illness because that's not add to the reproduction or not, and then you have to argue why, whatever. But if you develop preferences through your own individual trajectory in life, and you are okay with it, it doesn't narrow your capacities, and you don't suffer that, and you feel it, but then there's just nothing wrong. But you might want to open up or narrow if you have all the conditions where you can't commit to anything, and you need kind of a partner, call it a therapist, whatever, to help you channel better your normativity, self-produced normativity. Then it's fine, and this dialogue is open and is, I think, valuable. But I think there are other topics also can be discussed.
And
It's a different point.
in mental illnesses, I think this normativity, you have this very strong external source of the normativity, like this cultural space of society which is trying to kind of tell you you're not living according to the right norms, you're not functioning according to the norms that we think of as being a kind of well-organized human organism. And I think that at that point, interpretation, human interpretation, trying to understand different psyches and trying to navigate this in this more linguistic sphere of human intersubjectivity has to enter the picture to a far greater degree than when we are still studying more simple organisms.
Yeah, but if you already say there are social norms of normality and you classify this as mental illness, you are already being oppressive in a sense. So we have to be very careful. I think we are going to defend, so I wouldn't call them norms. Those are, I don't know, oppressive, sanctioning, whatever. We have vocabulary for that. But if you label those social norms like norms on the individual behavior of this kind, you already are, I think, not being, I don't know, respectful with the organism, but you are talking to or pointing at. You have to be careful with that. Social norms are complicated, for sure.
Because this is kind of what Kandian is also trying to show, that this normality in
Sure.
health issues, and I guess particularly when it comes to mental health issues, is a very problematic concept.
Can I switch the topic?
You can definitely switch
Yeah.
the topic.
So-
This is how it's intended also.
Alright.
You can go to different.
No, I just wanted to go back to your intervention because for me it is really valuable to see this splitting point between two subdomains, right? So you mentioned one is vital normativity as an object of inquiry, and the other is the subjective aspect of vital normativity, right? Life as subjects, as you mentioned. But for me, the question is what the bifurcation point actually is. Is this a point of tension? Is this where a dichotomy is formed? Is a bridge for building opportunities? What it is? Clearly, I think that those of us that fall on one domain and those of you that fall on the other cannot really claim that one will be able to solve vital normativity as a problem space in general. But I think it's useful to look at the other position because we are able to pinpoint some of the biases, some of the shortcomings, some of our limitations, and we forget our own biases, shortcomings, and the other is good to see. Right? For example, I clearly belong to the object of inquiry camp, and for me, the other approach might suffer from certain biases, for example, presuming that there is a phenomenon of life, and for me, this is a sort of abstraction one. The other is that I agree the importance of our human experience to try to understand life, but why should we presume that really our experiences can tell us a lot about all the types of organisms? Life is, living organisms are so diverse, millions of years of evolutionary history. Why should we be that qualified for access about understanding what the behavior of an organism is, what is guiding them? So for me at least, there is a point here of friction, of tension. I clearly understand that for the other side, people are trying to build models and try to do more the nitty-gritty stuff. We're clearly leaving out the subjective aspects here, and this is a really important shortcoming. But I don't know if for our own different philosophical projects, which I don't think they are necessarily converging, do we really need to take all the others? So I'm really wondering, like, what can we really do? We have really identified a bifurcation point. We call it of two different habitus that come with particular metaphysical commitments, that come with particular epistemological elements of what we foreground as important and that deserves to be explained. And also particular methodological approaches of how we would do it, right? They come in particular. So maybe a good way to start would be to try to make explicit this from the get-go. Like what is that the people that care about the vital normativity as an object of inquiry, where they are coming from, and then the other where they are coming from, what are we missing, what do we gain by talking to one another, and perhaps perhaps there could be cases where we should need to bracket out the other to try to sort out the problem.
So
And I don't know if this is necessarily a problem. I don't think we necessarily need to, want the unificationist approach towards vital normativity, because we are going to leave things out. Always. We're going to leave things out.
yeah.
So I don't know.
No, I agree with that. But one thing, maybe I just wanted to
Yeah.
maybe specify something. So today's separation into the object and the, let's say, methodological framework, however you want to call it, was strictly so that I would have some sort of a schema where I would be able to classify different topics that emerge. Yeah. But with regards to what I say that for me personally is very, very interesting, for example, the idea of somebody studying life, living forms, living phenomena, and at the same time that person, so to speak, embodying life, the being the vital structure. It's like, I don't think that this necessarily leads into, for example, a negation of being able to either understand life or organic forms or living phenomena or even doing science. The only thing it does, it raises a very interesting question, for example, of the origin or the groundedness of knowledge itself, so to speak. So what I mean by that is that, if you yourself as a living being are somehow doing some sort of cognition about a certain object, this cognition and the categories and all of that haven't fallen completely out of the sky. And it's not only that they're also anchored into a historical or cultural context. Yeah, that's very interesting. But at the same time, they are somehow rooted in you being alive. Now, what I want to emphasize here is ultimately one can find an interesting story to show that this is not necessarily relevant. Yeah, you might show, sure, I'm alive, but I'm also a rational being, and rationality somehow, in a very important sense, either completely diverges from vitality, or it is a mode of vitality which radically changes what vitality can do. And this is something that, for example, Cancuilhem would do, or Merleau-Ponty. They would say there are different ways of being a living body, for instance. Yeah? But the thing is that once you take this on board, of course, you don't have to do it with everything that you do, for sure. I agree. But it is a certain type of a meta question that cannot then just be discarded. You have to, in a certain sense, respond to it. Once it is raised in this way, and especially, look, it is not a problem for a mechanicist. Why? Because in a certain sense, he's accounting for mechanisms, and he or she, and here let's leave he, okay? So, and that person is, him or herself, also a machine, mechanism, like a mechanism.
So then it's a he.
But that's what I said. So in this regard, there's nothing interesting to be necessarily said. But once you have an organism, and you say this organism will, in a certain sense, respond to an environment in a non-neutral way, which means that it will somehow impose itself on the environment. Well, you yourself are an organism. Yeah. So, and the scientist itself, herself. So, then it is no longer a trivial question. It cannot be discarded in this regard.
But if I may, a brief response, but I think in philosophical inquiry, we always depart from a particular ground and take for granted so many different things. Clearly, for certain questions about the knowledge of life could be important. Well, where does that knowledge come from? Does it ground in vitality or is it not? But there are also, for anything that was mentioned from the other side, we could also pinpoint like, well, you're taking for granted this idea. Where does it come from? And we could go back and back and back. So I think that in philosophy, sometimes or always we make cuts.
I agree with you.
We need to justify the cut in a way, but it's unavoidable. I don't think there is a philosophy of totality in principle possible in any meaningful way. So I don't know.
Yes, I agree. But for example, this is the last thing that maybe then others can chime in.
Yeah.
For instance, why this could be relevant? When one does for example, philosophical inquiry. One thing that, and this is maybe just like a personal addition, I started off as a hardcore analytic philosopher. Okay? So when I say these things, I'm not necessarily like, yeah.
Hey, wait. What happened?
Well, life.
Life happens.
Life happens. Anyway, but the thing is that one thing I do resent analytic philosophers here is they do a meta-philosophical overview, but they will do it in a way where very strongly precludes certain positions. They are not even taking them seriously. And for example, they will usually exclude these types of inquiries. They will not be relevant for them. And I'm not trying to now, for example, defend for, I don't know, like some hardcore transcendentalism or either some sort of, for example, you know, you can also go into certain strands of Lebensphilosophie where ultimately life is the mystery of which nothing can be said and all that. It would be also a fair thing to mention these things, but just having this recognition of when we do the meta-philosophy of life, that you also have the positions that, and you try to do this when you open up the space and said the in-between, but these interesting in-betweens, what I have the impression is they're not just in-betweens, they add an additional dimension. So you get a three-dimensional problem space. Because then many of the things where, for example, you can simply say in analytic philosophy, oh, non-epistemic, epistemic. Where did epistemic come from? Did it fall from the sky?
But I agree with you.
Yeah.
This is a clear problem. But the other side also comes with
For sure.
philosophical commitments that also preclude certain lines of inquiries.
Absolutely.
It's not necessarily the fault of analytic philosophers. It's the fault of all philosophers.
Agreed. So that's why I think that at some point there should be this, I don't know how to call it, but maybe trans-analytic continental move, where you basically do try to do these types of meta-philosophies, which would be at some point like, look, I'm not going to allow that a certain limited tradition is going to impact how I'm going, because then if you talk about meta-philosophy, you're being completely disingenuous in a certain sense. Yeah? This is not a critique, again, completely not of the presentation, or not. It was useful, it was meant as a pragmatic, but more on a meta-meta level, so to speak. Yeah? If you want to be honest and fair with regards to this, you do have to, if you want to do meta-philosophy, you'll simply have to bite the bullet and simply say, okay, I'm going to also include the positions which, from my perspective, are maybe, you know, I find them weird, but I'll have to try to understand them. And this is not me now defending, yeah, continentals there, they have their own set of very serious issues as well. So, you know, this kind of pooling across these traditions, I think, in many ways, is fruitful, almost necessary. Yeah. Wow.
I'm actually about to leave because I have another point. Just one sentence adding to. Just very quickly. This needs a methodology of research which puts into action that in the researcher, which is not just rational mind. Needs to get out and ask the trees what is important, for example. This is a big abyss to jump over for a scientist, of course, because that's doing something totally unrational. But this is how it works.
This I understand and I appreciate the sentiment, but Andreas, there is a certain point where this can then be so seen as so divested from scientific knowledge that I myself am not willing to do the jump or leap to this degree, you know? I understand this, so this is why I said shall versus mechanicism as the two extremes. There is also a reason why scientific knowledge developed. Like it wasn't just imposed. You know, you can very easily and quickly play the socio-political game where this was just, you know, yeah, okay, maybe there's something to that, but there was a genuine enthusiasm for this, and a genuine feel like, okay, this is something of value. And I think this needs to be properly understood, not just as, you know, this is a big bad wolf. Sure, now it ran its course, so to speak. It started becoming tired. But just saying now we're gonna just, you know, shove this aside.
There is no either or. You know? Like Loretta started to do first-person science, and this is why I had this bonnet on, because I was doing first-person science. You know, there's no either or. It's not like we're leaving science now and now we're becoming animists again. It's let's incorporate. Let's do a session in which the ecological self is asked in the ways this is done in all other traditions, and then we work with this.
Okay, and this
There's no because very quickly if it becomes an either or, of course, it won't happen. But you can. I mean, that's at the end of Ferrer's life. He was very much opening to this. That was his idea. First-person approach means there's something in myself which must be part of the research. So
Yes, I agree with that. The main question is probably, again, something that Alejandro was raising. So how do you, it's one thing to say, this would be nice to include, but then how do you, make the connection?
But I don't think there exists, Andreas, I don't think there exists rational thinking. I don't think there exists something like scientific thinking that is detached from nature observation. I observe my daughter, I fall in love with her, I look at the sky. I do, butterflies being inspired and observed and their connection with chaos theory. There is nothing like pure, rational, cold, Western thinking. We think, scientists think with their bodies, including their hearts and their connection with others. So I have no opposition to going to an observatory and ask the tree, but I don't see how regular scientific inquiry is not already embodied heart. There is nothing like pure cerebral knowledge. We know that. And so I can't really see that big of an opposition.
I mean, give you a little example. That's when somebody says, "I will formalize the shit out of it." Then I have the faint intuition that the heart is gone. So I know what you say because you feel it. But then in the practice and in the discussion and in the conversation and in the way to present it and in the way the peers look at this is excluded. I mean, in the last talk, this was exactly what Kasira was about. So there's something which is, it's dangerous to exclude this. I believe you that you have this, but the practices of representing this excluded intrinsically. And I mean, this was just it was also funny and somehow cheerful, but that was just an example. I want to formalize it, and then where's your heart in formalizing it?
Mathematicians are being studied as the people that think more with intuition with their bodies. So I don't know what's wrong with formalizing. It's beautiful. We've been doing it since the Aborigines do marks on trees precisely to grasp form and embody meaning. But anyway, maybe we have to go for a walk in the mountains.
I think that Andreas also would like to point out that there would be more honesty with regards to this. What you said, you go somewhere and all of what you said is true, and usually the most brilliant people within the field will be willing to admit and speak about it, but then you have this way of textbook presenting it where, it's just about performing the method, doing the calculations, doing the observations. And unfortunately, this is still true. Like, you're going to pick up a random textbook, the way the whole approach is crystallized. So there's like an idealized version that is then being propagated, and everybody has to kind of, say it. It's like, the slogan that has to be repeated so that you're part of the club. If you start talking about it in ways that it's inappropriate, people, okay, at a cocktail party, you might start saying things, and okay, anyway, yeah. So maybe there's just more honesty or transparency with regards to this, and also just then, once you have this transparency, then of course people will start to think, but how do we then think about, what scientists is doing? And then all of a sudden, let's just use one example, the enactivist framework might become interesting. Because, it seems more in tune with what you just said, like mathematicians doing more intuitive work, and also scientists being always embedded, using the heart. So this is something that I think would be very valuable in this regard.
My question is really related to this and something that, like, as a PhD student, I'm kind of wondering because for me, the formalized methodology is as interesting as the experiential methodology, and all I ever witnessed in conferences when this comes up is that it's discussed as like two complete opposites. And I'm kind of wondering, like, okay, if I'm starting to do research, how can I integrate both of these approaches? Because I read the neurophenomenology paper and like some stuff by Villa, and I really liked it, but I don't see any practical work that has been done in a way that actually left a mark on the scientific community. So for me, instead of like discussing what is kind of like the abstracted version of formalizing and what is the abstracted version of experiencing, I'm wondering what are the lessons, what are the little steps that we can do in scientific practice.
But I think we're so like clarified this, it's either experiential or it's like scientific, but I think mostly like we miss the whole political, social aspect of this, because you could say, okay, what is valuable for a scientist is, for instance, not sort of understanding his or her historical context, so not just being like in this mode of like I'm just now synchronicity, synchronally researching something, but that there are traditions, traditions of people that have been developing this, and that like learning about that, and also then there's the question of learning about where you get your funding from and stuff like that. So in a way, understanding that you are not completely isolated from some sort of a social political context, and that no knowledge production is in a way. So that would be like my sort of political experiential take on how to include more like of this into the research. I'm not sure about the embodiment, but even politics itself is like embodied in a way. So.
Yeah, I get it, but I see that as like it's much more a problem that I have in research than I imagined when I like wanted to do a PhD, like the socio-political dimension. But I'm really like looking for like best practices, or like even like how to do it, because I think like this dichotomy doesn't get us anywhere closer to connecting philosophical and scientific practice.
Maybe you're already doing it without knowing it. Maybe you're already, investing your being alive into the research that you're doing. Maybe by using terms like intentionality or teleology or talking about totality, you're already using the life in you. So maybe you just need to articulate what we are using without acknowledging it. And I think one way would be maybe to think about science as a sense making, not just coinciding with an object, but as a really articulated sense, which means being engaged in something, right? In a problem. Right? I think there is a lot of room for. There is some kind of the Jonassian version of this problem is very polarizing, because we have on the one hand the strong kind of life itself, or the pure phenomenality, and on the other side you have the object. But there are, I think, other ways how to think about this relation without this polarizing way of looking at the problem. That's something I wanted to say. There is a beautiful phrase by Merleau-Ponty who says, all zoology requires a systematic Einfühlung into animal behavior. And we can extend it to plants, I think, as well. So, this is exactly it. You need to empathize with what you are describing, even scientifically. But what does empathize mean here? It doesn't mean like I feel the pain of the sheep or the butterfly who's gonna die soon. It means that I'm taking up the behavior somehow, so I perceive it as intentional, And this leads me into some interpretations of what's going on, even on the mechanistic level. And without this leading, letting myself being led by the intentions I perceive, I don't recognize any mechanisms, I don't recognize any totality. We have those circles and the closure. Well, we are talking from the point of view of, we are talking retrospectively. So we are emphasizing this is a process. So it goes one and then influences another. And then if this is a process, it's developing in time. So who perceives it as a closure? Well, we perceive it retrospectively as a closure. So we are investing this, as Husserl would say, this is a retention, right? If it's a process, it's in time. So how we can say it's circular? Well, because we retrospectively, put it all together into one circle, right? Okay, I stop there. But hopefully
This isn't part of the issue here that I'm not sure. Are we entirely clear what is the dichotomy of what is the radical difference of these two approaches? Because I think both this more traditional scientific approach takes experience into account as well as the philosopher or the phenomenologist. But they do seem to do it in very different ways, and yet the result is kind of different. Although again, even if you give experience and this first person perspective to a philosopher, to a phenomenologist who is supposedly maybe more attuned to this more subjective dimension, the end result is going to be pretty abstract. It's not going to be much more or less abstract than what, say, empirical scientist or formalizing scientist is going to do. So I think it's important to try to get down what is this dichotomy, where does it stem from, what is bringing these two sides of these two approaches apart?
I just now having thought also, it has to do with Ian Hacking, so that this looping effects of humankind. So this would be like that if you're researching like other people that are some sort of cognizers, you are also influencing them because it's not a like physical particle, and even that's maybe discoverable, but like it's affected by your research of it, but not only on the level of humans, okay, that's I think pretty obvious, but even on the level of, for instance, organisms, because of this plasticity of organisms, because of this sort of normativity, there are like studies where, in biology we have this model organisms, so these are like some sort of standardizations of organisms that are used in research over and over and over again. And it has been shown even that like through the material practice of engaging with these sort of organisms, you sort of reify some of their characteristics. So basically by them being incorporated in your research domain, they start to gain certain characteristics, and then you use those characteristics to universalize to all of the other species. So just being aware of things like that if you're dealing with an organism on the other side of your research lens, it's going to react in some way when you are researching it.
I had a very similar thought process, and also in relation to what you asked, like how would one conceive of concrete implementations of neurophenomenological methods, and I saw exactly that I was thinking more in the order of human beings, but I think it's especially relevant here, where I sort of dislike the notion of the expression experience. It's sort of unclear what is really at stake here, I think. But I think the experiential part of this for me is the processual creative part of thinking, in the sense of, so I would say that what people mostly mean when they sort of see some drawbacks to the scientific method or chemicist method would probably be that we try to conceptualize phenomena as if you were totally detached, as if your interaction with the phenomena wouldn't have any sort of practical effects on what you're observing. And so this, I think, it's even
totally legitimate to have this sort of method when you're dealing with, let's say, physical objects who actually don't really significantly change in your sort of experimental interactions. But then, of course, human beings, as Ella said, also other types of phenomena. But for human beings, I think this is especially important when you're doing cognitive science, let's say. I mean, I think one of the best aspects of Varela's embodied mind for me was the idea that embodied thinking isn't sort of a given in some sense, right? So he also has a sort of almost political or a sort of agenda to sort of spread a specific type of thinking. And what he's saying is that maybe that's a cultural problem that we have in Western societies, and we actually don't engage in those. I mean, it's not, his claim is not that embodied, I mean, in some sense it is, but he also wants to say that embodied thinking isn't sort of universal feature of human beings. People can also take different sort of positions towards the world. Maybe you want to just manipulate symbols. It's totally, you can do that if you want, but you can also take an embodied approach to stuff. So when you're doing your phenomenology, maybe you have to consider that maybe even embodied thinking is a sort of creative process, or maybe even to bring embodied thinking into the world is a sort of creative process. And for me, that was sort of a very, sort of almost mind-blowing thought process was when I was dealing my PhD with affectivity. I don't really have a sort of a direct experiential account of what affect is. It's not like there's this experiential realm where I totally know what's going on, and then the naturalization part just comes with, okay, so now let's translate this into sort of symbolic language, whatever. It doesn't work like that, because I really don't know. I have no idea what's going on in my head, really, and I'm grappling with exactly this sort of open indeterminacy of my own experience. And then, of course, it's like, I think at some point you have to consider that maybe what I'm really trying to do myself in this context was not so much as give a universal account of what, let's say, affective phenomena are, as much as sort of bring about a specific structure where I have some sort of stake in claiming that these are affective phenomena. I'm sort of engaged in what I really want to take as my object of inquiry, if that makes sense. So there is a sort of almost I have an agenda in trying to provide a specific account of what affectivity is.
I'm very happy to push the agenda as well. I mean, it's all the points that you raised. The thing where I'm looking for practical advice is really decided to work with neuroscientists, and they work on models of creativity, and that's already a very complex topic, and we will discuss the most well-known models of creativity in neuroscience. And I kind of brought up the point that Marie Hesse, the philosopher of science, already in the 50s, kind of made this argument that scientific hypotheses come from a creative process and not just from data. And I wrote that in the paper, and they were like, "What? Really? It doesn't come from data?" And I'm like, how do you catch these people? You know? I think
clearly that's one way.
I mean, we had a long discussion. They were very confused about that statement, but I think we have a very high-level discussion of how to reframe the debate, but we're missing a little bit the living experience of neuroscientists or biologists.
Canguilhem has a very interesting, it's a pity Charles will left, because that would be interesting. He says something in one of his texts that life is that which creates or produces forms, whereas the cognition then breaks them apart or uses them, but not in the sense breaks them apart like in a bad sense. But precisely what you said, this is a very interesting aspect, and it also relates to what Jan said and what was Timothy saying, Ella. So that there has to be a certain field that somehow opens up for you to be able to then engage with it in a sense. So one potentially not critique, but not in a bad sense, not I want to now show why this is, but that when you do science, the classical one, so to speak, it is always one step after this has already happened. So the interesting question that emerges, is there an interesting story to be said about this, of opening up a field within which you can then operate analytically, for example? Because clearly something delineates it for you, and the biggest mistake is then that this domain opens up, and then you approach it, and then you retroactively pretend as if this domain was already the way it became after you started dissecting it. But clearly this is not the case. So something had to open up in a way that pulled you in and somehow delineated the contours of your research, but not in the same way that it was already pre-specified, because then later, 20 years later, somebody does the same for the same phenomenon, and they come up with a different account, right? So then you have this naive, ongoing debate between scientists, yeah, the previous theories, they were silly, blah, blah, blah. Yeah?
Can I make it quick?
Yes.
But I don't know how this is only a problem for the scientists and also for the philosophers of life. Because for me, one of the main problems is believing in the idea of life, because it gives you a flattened ontology of what living organisms have been, are, or could be, right? Like somehow we could know about all of these creatures that we have never seen, that we have never looked how they lived, etc., etc. So how is not also opening a particular space with particular domains, for example, the three aspects of vital normativity, sensu kankian that you followed, and that people here have followed, and then are doing inquiry, looping on these ideas as if they are already correct, they capture what vital normativity is, namely applying to all life. So I see the same problem, the same tension, the same problem for the scientific approach, also for something like philosophy of life. I don't think we can escape this.
Yes, but would you at least be willing to agree that there might be an interesting difference between describing something and you really try to kind of capture this domain, but with this describing you don't necessarily even know what it means, so you're in a certain sense just, or then applying a very specific framework which will already presuppose that, for example, efficient causality is what is required for explanation, something that will have to be included if something is to be an explanation for something. So, for instance, already this distinction is a non-trivial one. Why? Because if you're operating within description, you might not necessarily presuppose that you already know what you will need for an account. However, the second step already has implicitly endorsed that it knows what it will require for that. So this is maybe an interesting, but and again, one thing that I would like to say here, if I emphasize, for example, or try to kind of carve out a certain domain, I'm not really trying to do it productively, like in the productive spirit, in the sense of how do you think about these things that would, maybe make the whole domain more nuanced? Because again, I do not want to trivialize what happened with the introduction of science. And Jan will maybe know this quote better than I do, but Merleau-Ponty at some point, he says, if the scientific revolution didn't happen, phenomenology could not have been born. It had to be created as a contrast foil. It's like, when I was saying, you recognize the norms by infractions of the norms. So once you have the infraction of the norms, you cognize, there was a norm there. We were joking with Moritz. He said, so what's the norm for how many croissants you can eat? I said, well, just eat them. You will know when you eat it. So, you didn't even know that there was a certain something. And the same in a certain sense had to happen here. Like, there had to be a certain something, a certain movement in a certain direction, and a very potent one of science, so that you could actually even see that which was, let's say, not left out, but sometimes you need a very strong light so that you recognize that there's a shadow against which it appeared or something like that, If everything is blurry in the same way, you don't even have the feeling of the light and shadow. I'm using metaphors here, but just to make a point. So I'm not trying to dismiss this aspect. No, I'm actually trying to take it seriously and maybe see what is it that maybe has been omitted and whether there's an interesting story and how it could be done without necessarily then saying, well, all of this is just lifeless, anemic, we don't need it, it kills, And it does, but I'm not saying that it necessarily has to under all the conditions, so to speak. So that's one thought about that. No. Okay, I'm already getting signs. But maybe Aranza hasn't said anything, Vera hasn't said anything, maybe any
I
thoughts?
didn't say anything because it has been very interesting to listen to all you, and I'm not sure, because the conversation is one day.
All over the place.
And to the question, how can we work as philosophers, and how can we put ourselves in the work we do? I think that there is a very big change between the philosophy done by Josquin or Merleau-Ponty or these people, and we normally work together. And I think that's a very, very important change in the way philosophy is done these days. Because, and I think it's extremely good, and it's going to be very, very enriching that we are seeing many things. Because whenever you work, not always, but sometimes it can be just an instrumental association of two people to get more papers or but if you genuinely start to work with another person, then you really confront with the other person and with yourself and in the conversation. And I think that what you have done, you have been presenting together and you presenting together. I have done that many times. And it's really a joy to work with another person, even if the presentation is perhaps not better than a solo one, but the process of working is better, and normally after, not maybe one presentation, but normally the result is a lot better. Because, as I said yesterday, I think if we are talking of normativity, we have to take into account conflict. And if we don't consider conflict and how conflicts sometimes are resolved, many times are not resolved, then we are not really understanding normativity in the domain of interorganismal living beings or persons. And I think that considering that we can do things together with others, and that is going to be enhancing diversity, is something that we should consider as a way to even get the community to accept topics that you say that they don't accept. It's going to be a lot easier to present topics if you work together with others and you have a force, because of many points of view together, many internal discussions in the work. So I think that sometimes the collaboration doesn't reach a consensus, but that is very good for philosophy and for the diversity of philosophical topics, and for making, for explaining to others why what we think together is interesting. And in that sense, Francisco Varela is different from George Canier or from Merleau-Ponty, because he worked with others. Most of his work is first with Maturana, then the embodiment with Thomson and Elizabeth Ross, and he has things, principles of biological autonomy, he did on his own, but many things he did with other people. And maybe that's the reason.
But you know, even that book, the articles that were included were almost all co-authored, the formal stuff. He was working with Cohen, he was working with Gaugen, Robert Turfli, so even there, very interesting. Yeah. I don't want to put you on the spot, so if you don't...
But now I will.
No. The thing is that it's perfectly legitimate to say, like, it's been a long day, I appreciate it, but if you...
I already feel like I'm sitting in the middle.
Yes.
We're all watching you.
All the view.
No, but I don't think that is anything substantial for the discussion, because I really like this and I like to follow everyone and their thinking paths. But the only thing that I thought of when you asked for like specific examples, how to include maybe these opposing perspectives, and also what this means to have a relation to your subject, to your object, your research object. I thought of Barbara McClintock, so I wanted to bring a botany example, a female botanist, who says that she had this feeling for the organism, and this really had an impact into her scientific genetic research. And I think this is a great example of how you could maybe integrate this and still be accepted somehow in the scientific field.
Could you say it to me?
Very late.
Yeah, late,
She
but in the end,
had a lot of problems.
yeah, I think
With
it was
the
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this basically concludes this event.
Yeah, but the practical thing, what did you want this conversation for? Is there a
I just no, I really just wanted to see how basically people relate, and you know, very often you have these debates after talks, and then you know when you go and have lunch, but then you don't really have the opportunity maybe to open up space for some of these debates to come up, because it's interesting. For instance, you know, saying yeah, you know, for example, Andreas is gone, so let me be now his voice. Yeah, this is, you know, an interesting perspective, but it loses precisely what is the most essential. So I'm a living being, I have to kind of, I have to acknowledge the living. And then you say this, but there's no time for discussion, so we go to another presentation that maybe we repeat it 2 or 3 times, always a similar thing. But then here I was kind of hoping that we would maybe bring some of these topics out and just see where we are. I didn't know how in which direction to go. I just wanted to open up thematic field. Basically, it was up to you to take it anywhere. Like I said, we could also go into direction. Maybe somebody would say, okay, so how will we publish an edited volume now? It would be a legitimate, you know, thing. But I would be also interested in something like that. But I just wanted, there was no, it was what we were trying to do, the underdetermination, the creative polarity, you know? So it doesn't, it has a certain delineation, but then it can move in different directions, get very different specifications, so to speak. So that there's no end point, there's no telos as such. It has been partly instituted, and hopefully it will be continuing to institute itself.
The book that Xavier and I are editing now, the one that you referred to before,
Yes.
has the particularity that it's going, we don't know how it's going, but I think it's going to be very interesting. The particularity that the pieces are very short, very short. And so it's going to be a small book with very short pieces. And I think that this kind of, the materials that have been presented here could be interesting to do something
Okay.
to do something short.
Punchy.
I don't know, we have tried to make a structure so that probably we hope the book is going to be readable as a whole book. It's a short book and the pieces are short.
Sure.
So
Interesting.
maybe
We'll be interested to see the result of this experiment.
Yeah, we are sorry the book is closed because it was a result of a project.
Of course.
You know, it's always nice to invite people.
But maybe we figure out something for this time. It would be maybe potentially interesting to explore all the options. So
Yeah, you know, there were practical reasons because we wanted to go to the open access and it was too expensive to make a big book, but the short books were not cheap, but affordable. So I forgot to mention that in my talk, but I think I speak for everyone that it was amazing how we organized everything from the beauty of the aesthetics that I really value, all the, you know, everything, the website and the welcoming, the big efforts like, you know, that you all have given us a first-class treatment and everything. So thank you very much. It's really appreciated. It's a nice way to bring it together.